see, what's really gone wrong over the last few years is that the ITV companies, perfectly reasonably, have been able to keep pace with inflation by raising their own prices whenever they needed to, i.e. the advertising rates. We have not been able to keep pace with inflation because we cannot raise our price, the license fee. Only the government can do that, and the government, all governments, not a matter of party, all governments are very reluctant to do this.
Last November, the colour TV licence went up from £25 to £34, an increase of 36%. Yet last Friday, as ITV was excitedly preparing for the fourth channel and putting in bids for new franchises and breakfast television, the BBC was working out the details of its cuts. Cuts in staff, cuts in orchestras, cuts in new buildings and equipment, and cuts in programmes. According to The Times last week, the BBC is at a turning point in its history. Tonight we're going to point the cameras and microphones at our problems for a change rather than at other people's. Has Auntie BBC been crying wolf, or is her handbag really empty? Are governments and you, the public, to blame for not coughing up enough money? Or is the BBC over-bureaucratic, overstaffed and inefficient? In the studio is Alasdair Milne, Managing Director of BBC Television, some of his ITV rivals, some of the corporation's staff and critics, and on film, some of your views.
At the moment, you pay £34 a year for your BBC television licence. Do you think that's about right? Too much? Too little?
I think it's very much too much.
At the moment, you pay, what, 10p for a daily newspaper, and your BBC licence fee works out at 9p a day. Would you be prepared to pay more?
Yeah, I suppose I would, yeah. I watch a lot of telly, so I would, yeah.
I feel somehow that for someone who concentrates entirely on the ITV channel, that to pay £34 for a channel I don't look at is quite expensive.
I think it's quite incredible value for money. I think we could certainly spend a lot more money on that. If we were going to get the same kind of entertainment elsewhere, it would cost us a great deal more.
Well, I just think it's very, very good value for money, and the present day standard of inflation, we're getting it very, very cheap.
I think if it went up to £50, it would be reasonable. Present day prices, yes.
Do you actually buy your licence?
No.
Have you ever?
No.
Have you got a television set?
Yeah.
The BBC offers the most comprehensive broadcasting service in the world. 4 radio networks, 20 local radio stations and 2 television channels.
30 seconds.
Stand by, studio. Round reel 1, titles.
Good television costs good money. The BBC reckons a television studio and its crew cost £6,000 a day, and there are 7 major studios in the television centre alone. Even the telecine machines running film and the video recording machines that are playing in tapes for this programme cost £400 a day. Wardrobe and makeup cost a staggering £6 million a year.
Pick myself.
To shoot, edit and process the film for this edition of Man Alive cost £4,500, and the BBC has massive backup facilities. The programme libraries alone cost over £1 million a year to run, so it's not surprising the television service is going to cost a staggering £345 million this year.
Wednesday morning to you, with my thanks to Simon.
By comparison, radio is cheap. Radio 1 will cost £9 million this year.
It's the Radio 1 Roadshow.
Pete Murray does it. Diddy David does it. Terry Wogan does not.
Radio 2 is costing £19 million.
Thank you, Jay. How did you know about my personal habits, Jay?
Radio 3 costs £18 million and Radio 4 £23 million. Figures so vast as to be almost meaningless, and yet since 1971, radio has been free, paid for out of the television licence. Over the last 10 years, the television licence fee has gone up almost threefold. It may sound a lot, But in the same period, other public services have gone up far more. First-class postage has gone up fourfold. Electricity costs 5 times as much as it did in 1970, and so do rail fares. To have kept pace with inflation since 1970, the licence fee should be more than £40, but Parliament fixed it at £34 for the next 2 years.
The point is that they fix the fee, I hope with some relevance to the needs of the BBC, but also clearly with some probably more relevance to their immediate economic problems. That they were making the decision about the level of the BBC's licence, the time when minimum lending rate had just gone up to the highest level in 300 years, mortgage interest had just gone up to 15%, unemployment was going up, and the general economic situation was clearly very serious. So inevitably, any government fixing the BBC's licence at that time will be thinking considerably, and I suspect primarily, of how it fits into the context of their own economic situation. And what we need is somehow to take the fixing of the licence fee out of day-to-day politics.
The effect of day-to-day politics can be seen in almost any BBC building, like Lime Grove, home of such programmes as Panorama and Nationwide. They were to have gone to a new complex at Television Centre, but because of the present economies, the move has been postponed. The image of television may be glossy, even romantic. The reality behind the pictures, at the BBC at least, can be quite different. It's the regions that are bearing the brunt of a £90 million cut in capital projects. Here at Bristol, facilities for making programmes like Life on Earth are housed in prefabricated huts. Film editing rooms, the canteen and a new studio were to have been moved into a brand new building, but for the next 2 years at least, they stay where they are. And Bristol isn't alone. Other network production centres all over the country are suffering from the cutbacks. The BBC can save £90 million by not putting up new buildings, but it still had to find another £40 million in savings. It's proposed that English regional television will lose around £2 million, and that means jobs and programmes will go. And the costs have bitten even more deeply into radio. On Radio 4, less drama and documentary. On Radio 3, shorter hours. On Radio 2, no more Wagoners Walk, the single cut that produced the loudest cries of pain.
Lynn, I hope after what you've heard you're going to drop the idea of another court case.
I'll think about it.
Well, I hope you will. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Hey, you're not walking, are you, Peter?
No, my car's over here.
Oh, well, I was going to say we'll give you a lift.
No, thank you. I don't think it would be appropriate in any case.
Nobody in his right mind enjoys making cuts just for the sake of them in an organisation. We have been forced to make a number of economies which I would not have wished to have done, and we have been forced to postpone a number of improvements in our services which I had wished to have done, a number of capital improvements, for instance. But given that we do have to make cuts, then clearly we look at those areas where we think we can economise with least damage to our service to the public.
Five of the BBC's 11 orchestras are to be disbanded. 4 smaller orchestras used mainly for light music on Radio 2, and the prestigious BBC Scottish Symphony Orchestra. In all, these cuts will cost some 172 musicians their jobs.
Hello, it's me again, Manuel, with my own method for sounding wrong but spelling right.
Continuing education, which makes programmes on subjects as diverse as gardening and literacy, faces a 10% cut. It'll mean loss of jobs and a searching examination of priorities, but not, they insist, any cutting back in innovation and experiment.
I nearly die of frig. Cut.
Schools programmes, to the outrage of educationalists throughout the country, are being cut by 8% this year. Next year, schools are faced with a further 10% cut, and that'll mean less jobs and as many as 20 to 25 fewer new programmes.
Merci. Je vous en prie, monsieur.
Nobody is going to avoid being hurt, and some programmes may well be faced with even more pruning next year, meaning cuts in staff, money, and therefore output. And all programme makers are going to have to conform to vigorous new rules. Rules about the amount of film that can be shot, the number of days spent shooting it, and the number of days available for editing. Failure to conform to these rules has a simple penalty: the sack. To Jeremy Isaacs, former BBC and ITV executive, the cuts are only part of a long-term trend.
Well, I think that although it's not apparent to every viewer, I do think that the standard of the service being provided by the BBC has dropped over the last several years and is still dropping, and would have dropped even further and have been seen to have dropped even further had it not been that so many admirable BBC series, which we still see on our screens, are made possible, and only made possible, by co-production money.
Without co-production money, the BBC couldn't have afforded this series. The 7 programmes cost over £1 million, shared by the BBC and 3 other television stations. The enormously successful Life on Earth was also enormously expensive. Over £1 million, shared by German and American co-producers who put up a third of the money. An agreement that cost the BBC more than half the profits from foreign sales. And a major serial like Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, £750,000 for 7 50-minute programmes, shared by the BBC and Paramount, who put up a quarter of the money but get half the profit from foreign sales.
We still need to understand what happened, or rather, why it happened.
The BBC has also been accused of rank extravagance.
The hills are alive with the sound of music, with songs they have.
There was an outcry when the BBC paid £2.25 million for 10 showings of The Sound of Music, and almost as much protest over plans for what some saw as unjustifiable expansion.
This is BBC Radio Alasdair, broadcasting on 95.1 VHF, 188 metres medium wave, 1594 kilohertz, and also...
The corporation has been sharply criticised for its policy over local radio. At the moment, there are 20 stations, another 15 are planned for the mid-80s, 2 are being built this year. The intention is that there should be 35 local radio centres, giving coverage to 90% of England, a scheme fiercely opposed by commercial interests.
All right, my thanks to Peter Hiscox and also Stephen Butt, who've been having me out this morning. I'll see you tomorrow morning between 6:30 and 9:15. Look after yourselves. Bye-bye for now.
The BBC is also attacked for being over-bureaucratic. The story goes there are legions of faceless administrators behind locked doors in the anonymous corridors of the television centre. In fact, the general impression seems to be that the BBC handles its financial affairs rather badly. But according to the BBC, it's not just an efficient corporation, but the cheapest broadcasting organisation in Europe. There are 9 European countries with bigger licence fees than Britain, and many of their national stations take advertising as well. Productivity per man, the BBC maintains, has increased by 13% in radio and 5% in television in the past 10 years. And the BBC says that its studios are among the most efficient in the world, putting out more hours of television per day than any other major network. In fact, almost everyone in the business and the government agree that output of programmes has gone up, while the real price of a licence, when compared with wages, has gone down. And while the BBC's real income falls, ITV is able to raise its advertising rates to keep pace with inflation. Last year, ITV earned £385 million to pay for just one network, while the BBC had only £315 million, that's 70 million less, for 2 television channels and radio as well. And this imbalance is beginning to make it difficult for the BBC to compete successfully with ITV. Last year, it looked as if there might be no more Match of the Day on BBC. Michael Grade of London Weekend Television offered the authorities £4.5 million for 3 seasons exclusive rights. The court stopped him, but now football costs the BBC 4 times as much as it did. Bruce Forsyth was lost, paid £17,500 a show by ITV instead of £5,000 by the BBC. Morecambe and Wise went for £65,000 from ITV instead of £10,000 from the BBC.
When my father stood here 26 years ago,
The real competition from ITV comes not from the loss of stars, but from the fact that commercial companies can make programmes like Edward and Mrs Simpson on a scale that the BBC is beginning not to be able to afford.
I certainly think that the discrepancy between the funding of the two systems of broadcasting in this country poses as an enormous problem to the BBC. I mean, I think the fact is that for years there was a sort of equilibrium between the two systems, or anyway there was an equilibrium in resources and in the use of resources. When ITV was more interested in making money and less interested in making decent programs than it now is, it didn't pose the same sort of threat to the BBC as it now does. But like it or not, and I hope we all like it, ITV has taken a very considerable tumble to itself in the last decade and has done its damnedest to make really good programs. And that means often, not always, but often spending more money on doing them and hiring more ambitious program makers who set higher standards not just for themselves, but for everybody who works with them to come on board. And that means that salaries are driven up, and it means that the BBC has to compete for talent.
So it's not the BBC in Eastbourne filming Dennis Potter's latest play, it's London Weekend Television, although many of the key production staff are ex-BBC. It's being directed by Gavin Miller, one-time presenter of BBC Two's Arena film series. Kenneth Trodd, producer of such BBC series as Dennis Potter's Pennies from Heaven and Blue Remembered Hills, is now producing this film for London Weekend. Okay, when it comes to writers, actors, actresses, how does the pay differ between the BBC and commercial television?
Well, it differs by about, I suppose, 30%, and that's a rising difference. So that in sheer financial terms, the incentive to work for the BBC is not there if it's any money or after.
So why does anybody work for the BBC?
They work for the BBC because there are quite a lot of things, particularly in the field where I used to operate, which is expensive single-play drama, usually on film, where only the BBC will do what you want and do it the way you want.
Yes. And how far do you think the BBC relies on what might be called inherited goodwill?
I think quite a lot in that way. Inherited goodwill, and also remember that it is still half of a duopoly, if you like. You've only got really two chances of working if you're an actor or a writer. So that it isn't simply that you go to the BBC because they pay more, they pay less rather. They may be just the one of the two who will do the thing that you want to do or who offer you work at that time. So the BBC will never be short of people to work for it. It's just whether the overall standards of excellence will perceptibly decline, and I think they probably will.
Do you find it easier to make good programmes with commercial television than with the BBC?
No, I think there are the same numbers of very, very talented people in both. I found that the effort at LWT, where I'm now working, is the equal in all departments, makeup and wardrobe and design and photography, and as the equal of the BBC. But that's because it's at the top level, maybe. I don't know about further down. This is a fairly lavish production by anybody's standards. But I don't think anything about the personnel is different, nor the willingness to do the best possible job. What is different is the fact that there is more money in commercial television. They just have more money, and there's no way around that. And I suppose it's a legitimate grievance on the part of a state broadcasting system, however independent, that it trains people, as BBC does, and trains people throughout the world, and then loses them to other employers at the point where they're highly trained and they've been a capital investment.
Makeup girls are just one example of the continuous seepage there is from the BBC of staff that it's trained.
They keep on taking in new schools of trainees who stay for the 2-year training period, and then they tend to leave.
How many girls were there on your course when you started?
There were 13 who actually reached the BBC TV studios. 2 actually went off to the regions, so there were 15 to start with. And out of the 13 who were with me back at BBC Base, there is now only 1 left of my school.
What made you leave the BBC to go to work for independent television?
I think basically it was money, really. I found that having bought a house and sort of moved out of London, that could no longer really cope with it. And I was looking for increasing salary.
What made you decide to leave the BBC?
The main reason was money.
How much more do you get paid at commercial than you do at the BBC?
I would think 25 to 35% more, and work shorter hours.
I'm the chairman of the Necky Craft branch, which is of all ITV studios. We know of all applicants, especially at London Weekend for the craft jobs, at least 70% of applicants are for the BBC.
Commercials not only finance the whole of ITV, they also pay for companies set up to provide specific services. For instance, this videotape recording and editing complex set up in Soho, the heart of London's commercial filmland. It's staffed almost entirely by ex-BBC trained and BBC employed videotape engineers.
What be the difference?
And what made you leave the BBC?
I was totally disillusioned with the way things were when I left, which was about, I suppose, 2 years ago. And after nine years there, I was earning the Prince's sum of £4,000, which then wasn't a lot. And I think that was the main reason that made me leave.
And how much do you get paid now?
Now? Oh, about 3 times that.
My main reason for leaving was because the salaries weren't very high, and also because promotion prospects were very poor.
The working conditions aren't as good. The things one takes for granted at the BBC, canteens, sports facilities and things generally, they're non-existent here, but they don't pay the mortgage.
Alasdair Milne, it can all sound a little like sour grapes, the BBC going on about ITV and its wealth. How much are the BBC problems, in your view, due to BBC cash shortages, and how much of the fact that the ITV, in your view, has too much wealth?
Well, the two are indivisible in the sense that we've heard about, from Ian and others, the long process of the licence fee decline. It goes back many years, 18 years, in fact, if not more. But alongside of that, of course, has been, and I think Michael and Bill would agree, the unprecedented profits that ITV have made, even through the very bad times of 1974-5.
But why does that hurt you so savagely? Is it not simply sour grapes? Can you not get recruits?
No, at one time, 18 months ago, we were in desperate trouble about recruiting altogether. It's better now, but we are the only people who train, as was said on the screen. Without being too strong about it, I mean, for 25 years, we have been the only people in British television who trained a whole range of craft skills and producer skills. And therefore, when a cash crisis occurred at our end and not at theirs, people quite naturally, as they said, leave.
Bill Brown, are you being parasitical in independent television? Would it help the industry if you were less bloated?
Well, not at all. Alasdair says that 25 years ago they were doing all the training. Well, that's a fact because, of course, we weren't in existence then. We do train. We train less in a less centralised manner than the BBC, but there's a great deal of training goes on at the companies around the country.
Is that really true?
Yes,
compared
it is true.
to the BBC, is your training programme, frankly, anything on the same scale? Are you not filching staff at an enormous rate?
No, we're not filching staff at an enormous rate. The fact is that in 1978, 135 people left the BBC and went to independent television. 4,800 people left the BBC full stop in that year. So something under 3% of those who left the corporation actually went to work for ITV.
Alasdair Milne, in fact, one wonders whether the public...
The point, though, is, Bill, is it not, that these were highly trained people, videotape editors, makeup artists. It takes 4 years to train them, and you don't. That's all I was trying to say.
Well, we don't have one single VTR editor in my company who worked for the BBC, perhaps one. So we do train our own, and these chaps on the film were not actually working for ITV.
One wonders, Alasdair Milne, whether the public aren't going to think at any rate that the BBC is crying wolf. You say you've had cash shortages for 18 years. You're still going fine?
A cash shortage in the sense that the licence fee to do all we wanted for a long time back was not adequate. But in the 60s, of course, inflation was very low, and colour buoyancy and the rest carried us forward.
Colour buoyancy means people were shifting from black and white sets to colour sets, and therefore paying more money.
The critical years have been, after all, since the early 70s, where inflation has gone rampantly on, while the colour graph slowly began to flatten out as people got to a point where more were converting to colour than existed in black and white still. And that's been the core, the basis of the problem, really.
But Vincent, Hanna, one wonders, from a trade union point of view, one wonders whether some of these cuts aren't frankly healthy for the organisation. Isn't there a good deal of restrictive practice, a good deal of overmanning, a good deal of bureaucracy, a good deal of flab?
Well, taking it in order, I mean, no one, least of all journalists, will say that public money shouldn't be saved.
And therefore you would have to say that some money, some savings in public money are desirable, and insofar as the BBC is saving money, that's a good thing. But don't run away with the idea that the BBC needs substantial trimming. It does not. The BBC does not need to lose 1,500 jobs.
It's efficient, in your view?
It's extremely efficient.
Can you honestly say it would be that efficient if the government hadn't been so careful about how much money it allowed the BBC to have over the last years?
It could not be more clear. By any standards that you wish to measure, by any set of figures you wish to produce, the BBC is infinitely more productive and more efficient than ITV. A simple figure. ITV are very chary about producing the number of people they employ and also the turnover that they have. But quite simply, any investigations we have shown showed that last year it cost about £19,000 an hour to run BBC television. Our investigation showed that it cost about £34,000 an hour to run ITV. And ITV, as Alasdair Milne quite rightly says, does absolutely no training. Bill Brown said that he does training. I'd like to ask you very simply, when was the last time that ITV trained a journalist, trained anybody in current affairs?
Let Michael Grade answer your first point first. Are you flabby and inefficient in ITV and dragging BBC down?
Absolutely not at all. The point that gets lost in all this is that, OK, we're one channel, but we're 15 companies with 15 major centres of production. The BBC is a very centralised organisation. All the main network programming comes out of this building where we are today.
But you in fact produced less regional programmes last year than the BBC did.
Not true.
Absolute nonsense.
That's not true.
Absolute nonsense.
And could I answer Vincent Hanna's point about training journalists? We train journalists. We have trainee journalists at the moment. Most other ITV companies do as well. A reasonable proportion of those on the staff.
Look, I don't want to get stuck on one aspect, which is training, which I don't think to the general public is of enormous interest. Tony Hearn, how painful are the cuts to you, the biggest union in the BBC? Frankly, to many outsiders, it looks as though you've got very little to complain about. You've got an organisation which has consistently expanded. All the time it's been crying out that it's been kept short of funds. It's taken on, I think, 3,000 extra people in the last 5 years. The cuts are frankly fairly marginal, aren't they?
No, the cuts are painful, and in fact they are worse than has been suggested by the film. I think 2 figures have been omitted which should be put to the public. The BBC's expenditure estimates this year are based on the assumption that inflation will be 16.5%. It's some 21% at the moment. Their figures for 1981-82 assume 12.5% inflation. There isn't a dog's chance of the inflation rate being that. That means inevitably there will be further cuts. Now, the existing cuts are already biting deeply. The full extent of them will only become apparent in the next few months. In television, for example, the budgets are being increased by some 10% at least less than would be necessary to keep pace with inflation. This will have a very serious impact on quality. The capital cuts mean that the transmitter programme development won't go ahead. Old buildings will continue to be used.
But will the public, frankly, notice? Will they be upset? As I say, the BBC has been complaining, as Alasdair Milne says, for 18 years. Has the public got noticeably anxious about the BBC's performance?
I think the public will become increasingly aware of the gaps that are going to be appearing. In local radio, there are going to be cuts in output. In regional television, there are going to be programme losses. In television, instead of more home-produced products, there are going to be more American imports. The public may like that or it may not, but the fact is there are going to be more of them.
You see, Alasdair Milne, I think many people believe that the BBC has only cut now, frankly, what it wanted to get rid of for a long time. It wanted to get rid of orchestras. It wanted to get rid of some of its community programmes, and that you've taken the easy way out anyway. It hasn't really hurt you much.
No, there's an element of confusion here, and on 2 counts. One is that when we came to review, when the Conservative government was elected last year, we reviewed the situation then, and we considered that after many years of regional development, which was entirely proper, the region started from a low base and they had to be expanded to the best of our advantage through the 70s, but that now we were going to face a second ITV channel, and that the competitive survival of the BBC as a major instrument of broadcasting in this country depended on the consolidation of the networks. We decided that in July of last year. The whole review that followed the agreement of the licence fee has been to try and follow that policy without actually doing massive damage to individual areas. Thus, regional television, although cut back, is not massacred. I mean, it's still there in a form from which it can develop, I hope, in later years.
Can I bring the politicians in here?
Yeah,
Because a
sorry.
great deal of concern has been expressed at Westminster, which I think, from their point of view, counters what you're saying. Julian Critchley, are you happy with the regional cutbacks?
I think the BBC's got it right. And I think, too, that Norman St. John Stevas has been able to go round the multinationals and the banks and has been able to get some money, at least, for some of the great orchestras. That may not be... that might not be of itself the solution to the BBC's problem, but no doubt it helps. Now, I would have thought they've got it right, except that I think that their attitude that they should go into local radio to the extent that they do is over-ambitious and ill-advised.
Barry Sheerman, does the Labour Party think the BBC has got it about right in the cuts?
I don't think so at all. We represent much more the regional point of view. Just look at the election returns. And we see a service that was reasonably sketchy and unable to compete with the commercial companies, getting worse and getting thinner. And the British public expect the best broadcasting service in the world. They're not going to have it with these cuts.
Should local radio be an area that the BBC dallies with? Can I put this to the trade unions? After all, independent local radio is showing that it can pull almost twice the audience that BBC local radio is getting.
It's a different audience, though, isn't it? We shouldn't forget that the BBC pioneered local radio, and there's not the slightest reason, in my view, why it should be forced out of it now. It certainly aims at a different audience and gets a different audience from ILR, and I think it's scandalous that it should be, in effect, prevented from competing effectively and expanding.
But the BBC, given its head, would expand into all sorts of areas, putting its fingers in virtually every pie in broadcasting that's going. Isn't it overstretching itself?
Well, why shouldn't it? If I may, Vincent, successive governments for 25 years have expected the BBC to be the major instrument of broadcasting in this country. That implies that it has to be a comprehensive programme maker, a maker of majority programmes and minority programmes throughout the United Kingdom.
Vincent, Hanna.
That's exactly the point. It depends what you want the BBC to do. The BBC is there to provide a service to the public. And in local radio, that is a perfect example. We provide contact with the local community in a way which the independent local radio stations don't even claim to do.
But the independent television sector and the independent radio sector do provide a lot of services which the BBC is competing with, and they, as far as the public is concerned, they provide it free. Julian Critchley.
In an ideal world, surely the BBC should compete at every possible level, but the whole idea of this programme is to decide that the world is not ideal and to try to decide what we should do about it. And if it is a question of having to make a cut, my own view is that independent local radio is something that the commercial interests do, in fact, remarkably well. And if I were a BBC Mandarin, I would be holding back on that.
Julian Critchley forgets, though, that this is a matter for public debate, and what in fact is happening is that the government, by its policies, is in fact favouring ILR against BBC local radio. Now, this should be a matter for open debate. It shouldn't be regarded as a fait accompli.
But there are many people in Westminster, Alasdair Milne, who clearly, and many people who write to the papers, who clearly believe the BBC should go into what they say it does best. That is Radio 3. That is the sort of public service
Yes,
broadcast.
that's nonsense, you well know. I mean, the BBC has been a highly competitive organisation throughout its existence. Of those who claim that Lord Reith, for example, albeit the only ran one radio channel, would abandon popular programmes, simply haven't read his books. The fact is, we have from the beginning from our very inception, tried to serve the public in its large numbers and its small numbers, in its majorities and its minorities. And if we were driven back ever into a corner of being a minority organisation, we wouldn't survive for a second, and rightly so.
Michael Grade, you've made suggestions in the past couple of months that the BBC could save a good deal of money if it was prepared to cooperate more with ITV and be less competitive.
Well, this, of course, was the independent television's strategy, in a sense, behind the football deal with the Football League. In a sense, we didn't put the price of football up. It was 92 impoverished league clubs, the majority of whose income doesn't actually come through the turnstiles. And as far as we were concerned, independent television, we had striven for years to reach some kind of measure of agreement with the BBC, not in a competitive way, but in a way to relieve the viewers of the saturation and duplication of sporting events. I mean, we were both at Wembley on Saturday for the Cup final. Between us, we probably spent £750,000 at Wembley on Saturday, covering the same event. It was the same result, the same match, the same cast.
Now, you reckon you could save broadcasting a total of £80 million a year if you...
Well,
got together-
Alasdair has made the point in print quite rightly that you don't actually save that money. What happens is that you still have to make programmes to put on the screen to replace sport, which is fairly cost-effective in programming terms. What I am saying is that with a major strategy, with the viewers in mind, the BBC might find a way of saving enough millions of pounds over a number of years to put more money into drama, into home-produced competitive programmings, which might knock us out of the ratings on the Saturday
You're choosing
night.
your words very carefully. I think you're hiding the fact there's a certain amount of bitterness behind this wrangle, isn't there, Alasdair Milne?
No, not really. I mean, a 432% increase, which was the result of London Weekend's bid for league football, didn't amuse me because it struck us both. But, I mean, I know what Michael Grade's saying. We've, across the years, have come to accommodation in all kinds of ways. I mean, the number of football games where we actually clash head-on is very limited in any given year. All we've said is that the total process of alternation with people who, in our judgment, do it less well is not a thing that we propose to go forward.
Well, there you have the root of the problem, you see. As long as the BBC go on believing that, and I believe on
the viewers seem to give a chord to it,
Not
you see.
true, Alasdair. On the last World Cup, if you look at the figures, on the last World Soccer Cup, where we were toe-to-toe for 3 weeks, saturating the airwaves with sport, we actually came out on top.
But it's always sharing, it seems, on your terms carefully worked out. I mean, Bill
Not
Brown,
at
why
all.
don't you in Scottish television return, 20% plus dividends on your shares last year? Why don't you take over the BBC Scottish Symphony Orchestra? Wouldn't your audience approve of that?
To begin with, you've got the dividend all wrong.
Well, let's take the substantive point. Why don't you do some of the things that the BBC is doing which are expensive? Why don't you take over the Symphony Orchestra for a start?
For a start, the Symphony Orchestra is very largely a radio orchestra. We run a television service. The last time I saw it on television in Scotland was years ago. So that's the first point. The second point is that there are many deserving causes which might look to ITV for help. And they get it, albeit in small packages, but rather than one large donation to, say, one orchestra, whose existence is in doubt anyway, as far as orchestra provision is concerned in Scotland. But rather than save one orchestra, for which we really have a very limited use, we pass the money around amongst a very large number of artistic bodies.
Does that satisfy you, Alasdair Milne? Do you think they're playing
Well, I
fair?
think the BBC Symphony Orchestra in Scotland is a particularly painful point for me above all, because I saved it 10 years ago as well. But if we can get other bodies, including Scottish Television, to come in some form or another, all we've said, as with all the orchestras, is that we, in the end, don't need them for broadcasting, and when put under financial pressure, have to take regard to broadcasting purposes as being primary.
Very briefly, if you can't get people like STV in to help the orchestras, there's already going to be a substantial cut in not just BBC services but some of the artistic things that the BBC looks after. What's going to happen if Tony Hearn's right and next year inflation is well over the 12.5% limit, which
That's
the BBC
a major
is?
problem, there's no question. I mean, the projection of the licence fee as set by the government and therefore by the Treasury indicated a 12.5% inflationary rise next year. They even now are saying that 13% by the middle of the year is what it'll be down to. If that doesn't happen, then we will have to go back to the government again and say these projections are wrong, the licence fee must rise.
Well, if the BBC has a problem while ITV is flourishing, why doesn't the Beeb go from its licence fee? Why does it cling so firmly to that? Why not be more adventurous? Why not, for a start, take advertising or look for other forms of finance? And if the BBC won't do it, why doesn't the government force it on them? Jeremy James now looks at alternatives to the BBC's article of faith, the licence fee.
Well, don't just stand there, young man. Check the oil, and I won't fall down.
This commercial cost £50,000 to make, not counting the fees paid to the stars in it, and it costs £70,000 a minute to show it on commercial television in prime time. Costs that are beginning to worry even the vastly rich oil company that made it.
They don't include the artist's fees, do they?
Nothing else, just the junction.
So the total is well in excess of £60,000, right?
The advertising manager of Texaco Limited, Clive Turner.
Why I want to know where it's all going to stop, because I cannot see that it's being contained. I feel that the production companies are virtually inflation-proof. the viewing figures for independent television are not particularly enchanting from the point of view of an advertiser. You're getting fewer viewers for the money you're spending, right? And the cost of making that commercial to be shown to those viewers is getting higher and higher and higher. And where's it all going to end?
In the end, the huge costs of advertising are reflected in prices in the shops, although some advertising agencies may dispute this, but then they would. In the end, the customer pays, if not through a licence fee, then through a few extra pennies at the till. But there are still those who believe the BBC could solve its financial problems by taking advertising, possibly in the end even doing away with the need for a licence fee. One MP who'd like to see such an alternative is Paul Dean.
Well, I would like to see advertising introduced. I'd start in a modest way. I wouldn't abolish the licence fee. I'd freeze the licence fee and say, now, start taking some advertising and see how the thing develops. I know there's some people who say, well, it's going to destroy the character of the BBC and all that. I doubt it, quite honestly, but it's a matter of judgment, this. If you take the Times newspaper, which is read throughout the world and is acknowledged as being an excellent newspaper, it relies very heavily on advertising. Advertising has not destroyed the character of the Times, and I don't see why it should destroy the character of the BBC either.
One, I don't think there's probably enough advertising to go round, and two, if you did, you'd have to compete and chase for the viewer figures. Now, the BBC put on some marvellous stuff at peak viewing times, which appealed to minorities. As it is now, they could continue that. If you did a 3-hour programme on Suez, which the politicians thought was marvellous a few months ago, but the public may be not interested in, if you were having to chase advertisers, I don't think you could do that.
It does seem that, in some ways, the licence fee has become almost an article of faith with the BBC. Why should the BBC not take advertising?
Because, in the end, if we did, it would debase the whole of broadcasting in this country. Whatever guarantees were given initially about limiting the amount of advertising, the next time we went to the government, any government, and said, may we now have an increase in the licence, any government would almost certainly say, well, why don't you take a little more advertising? And gradually it would creep up. This is what's happened abroad. Public service broadcasting organisations abroad have started with 15% advertising. They're now having to take 60% advertising. The more we have to take advertising, the more we have to go for the lowest common denominator, go for audiences, go for the ratings game. The more we have to, the more ITV would have to. And in the end, within a matter of years, you would find television in this country would be down to the level of television in the United States.
There is another, perhaps even more telling argument about advertising, the amount of revenue that would be available were the BBC to take advertisements. Harold Lind reported to the IBA on financing ITV2 and is quite certain what would happen if the BBC went commercial.
Well, obviously it would receive some advertising, perhaps quite a lot of advertising, and the total amount of advertising which then went on television would obviously increase because the BBC would have certain advantages which advertisers would want. But the important question is whether the amount of television advertising which was generated by the BBC taking television advertising would be enough to pay for both the BBC and ITV.
Do you think it would be?
No, I think it almost certainly wouldn't be. The extra television advertising might amount perhaps to 25% of existing television advertising, perhaps even to 50%. But that would still not be enough to finance the whole of BBC and the whole of ITV totally from advertising revenue. And what that would leave you is two more or less bankrupt channels. Or if you take BBC Two and the forthcoming ITV2, 4 more or less bankrupt channels.
What do you mean by television licence, please?
So if we're stuck with a licence fee, are there any ways of softening the blow of having to find £34 a year? For instance, payment by instalments, by credit card, by direct debit. And certain unfairnesses could be removed. The drive against licence dodgers could be hotted up. Those who don't pay their licence fee are reckoned to cost the BBC up to £25 million a year. And there are anomalies that many see as absurd. For instance, hotels like the Hilton, with 500 rooms and 500 television sets, pay only one licence fee, the same as an old-age pensioner. All sorts of other means of raising revenue, all alternatives to the licence fee, have been considered by governments. Some, like a state lottery, seem somehow inappropriate. But it's the idea of a direct grant from the Treasury that really horrifies the BBC.
I'm always astonished that people think that a grant in aid would actually produce less government interference. I cannot think of anything worse than having the entire BBC income coming through the Treasury. We'd have some of my best friends are civil servants, but we'd have them around this place like mice, going into everything that we're trying to do. I mean, we see with the trouble we have with the external services, and that is by far the least politically sensitive part of the BBC. And the Treasury and the Foreign Office, I mean, it's their job, are constantly nibbling away and saying, well, can't you cut this and can't you cut that?
The corporation does make money from selling programmes through television enterprises, some £4 million worth last year before tax up was. It also makes money from BBC publications, some £3 million last year before tax. That includes books, gramophone records, and of course the Radio Times and the Listener. But at the same time that the BBC has to tighten its belt, the 1980s could be a decade of almost unprecedented technological advances. There are already video cassette recorders. You can either buy or rent these. And a quite new thing, a video disc is about to come on the market. It looks exactly like a gramophone record. You can treat it like a gramophone record, you can spill coffee on it. But they are in fact records with pictures. And they're most complicated machines that go with them. You can freeze frames, you can run forward, you can run backwards, you can get stills. That is part of the new technology. And apart from that possibility of selling programmes for either putting on tape or on disc, there's going to be pay television by cable or satellites. Well, that's just on the horizon. Now, they could all be useful sources of money for the BBC, but none are even remotely likely to come near replacing the licence fee.
Even so, Alasdair Milne, it's clear that the BBC's already got its leg well into the commercial camp. Isn't it hypocritical then to say that you can't become even more commercial, even more self-sustaining?
If you mean enterprises, publications and the rest, I mean, enterprises had a turnover of 30 million last year, 2 million profits after tax, publications even less. We're talking about a 500 million a year industry. These are marginal additions.
Marginal, but surely they could be expanded.
No,
This
they
is the
can't,
point.
in our judgment. I mean, we will raise a bit the enterprises sales next year, but I mean, if you go into the possibility of television sales around the world, that's the sort of profit you're going to end up with. And that's a marvellous supplement. But it's nothing to do with the main funding of an organisation like this.
And there's a very important point, Nick. It's very undesirable, in my view, that the BBC should go too far into this, because if you get into satellites and pay TV too deeply, then you will be concerned, the BBC will become concerned with going for the mass audience more and more. And there will be a temptation which future managements might not be able to resist, that the quality programming, the public affairs programming, which the BBC is best in the world at, will be pushed into the background and you will go for the lowest common denominator.
Alasdair Milne, though, under your managership, has not the BBC become very, very competitive in any case?
Well, we've all had a hand in that for a long time. When Jeremy Isaacs earlier mentioned the decline in programme standards and attributed it largely to co-production, it's absolute nonsense. I mean, the co-production has been 3 million a year maximum for the last 5 years, and we're spending, in terms of programme allowance, 70, 80 million a year. These are very small sums, I keep trying to explain to people, you know.
I'm sure that Alasdair's right, that these are all marginal sums of money. It really does, in the last analysis, it is the responsibility of this Conservative government. It's our responsibility, I think, to see that the rivals have approximately the same amount of money to play with. And I think in the past it's true to assert that Conservative governments have favoured ITV. I mean, after all, it was our invention in the 50s, ITV1. We then introduced ITV2, and at the moment the bill is going through the House. We introduced independent local radio, and we're now expanding it. So quite clearly we have helped that particular side of the equation. All the more reason, I think, now for a Conservative government to make certain that the funds are roughly equal. Which brings one to a more important point, but I don't want to interrupt you in your task, and that is the relationship, certainly, between broadcasters and the politicians.
Surely,
and it's this that lies at the heart of your dilemma.
Surely you can't skate over that, though. I mean, you're talking about the Conservative Party's responsibility for certain actions, and I would be the first to say that the Labour Party holds a great responsibility for the niggardly way in which the BBC has been treated at certain times, and Harold Wilson, I think, was primarily responsible, but I think Mrs Thatcher is the partner in crime to Harold Wilson in terms of the way in which the BBC is being treated in a devious way, because the money isn't forthcoming. The money is being slowly edged back, if you like, and so the corporation doesn't have a decisive change. It slowly bleeds away.
Julian Critchley, how are you going to help redress this balance? I mean, with the greatest respect, and I don't think you object to the term, you are one of the people who've been called the wets in the Tory party. Now, is there not, among the more right-wing view, a genuine consensus that there ought to be an even greater shift towards commercial broadcasting?
Well, one of the largest wets in the Conservative Party is the Home Secretary, who is in fact the Minister for Broadcasting. You're extremely lucky that you have the largest wet in the Conservative Party, in fact, on your side. And he always told the story that both in the Shadow Cabinet and in the Cabinet, he never starts a discussion on broadcasting. He would never invite the Conservative Shadow Cabinet or Cabinet to discuss matters for broadcasting because he knows immediately what would happen. It would be one atrocity story followed upon another, with the Prime Minister's atrocity story being by far the longest and by far the worst. So what he does, in fact, is to decide what his policy shall be and says so.
But what is his policy?
That doesn't, yes, quite. This doesn't entirely redress the balance, does it? This time the BBC has been left with a very substantial shortfall. So how do you see this change coming about?
Well, it's very difficult to see how it will come about. I mean, I think you do have a friend in court in the Home Secretary. I think you would be wise to go back sometime next year and to show him the inflation figures and for the BBC to argue a case for a further increase in the licence fee. But the real problem is that all politicians, Labour and Conservative, all governments, somehow believe that if they increase the licence fee or allow it to be increased, they lose votes. This is the crux of the argument. In fact, they don't. There is no evidence whatsoever that the size of the licence fee had any relationship with the 1979 election.
Julian, but there are two sides to that. There are myths that are sedulously peddled in Parliament on both sides of the House of Commons, but there's also this myth within the BBC about the television licence. Now, I will defend the television licence, and many Labour MPs will, because the television licence provides a different type of base. What I do find most objectionable is the fact that people believe, or pretend to believe, that the BBC is more independent because it has this television licence source of income. It's not true. We see in the House of Commons, surely, that BBC is more cautious, less innovative, especially in the area that affects us, in current affairs and in news.
Hasn't Julian put his finger upon an essential point, and that is, over the past 5 or 6 years, haven't we begun to see governments unable to resist the temptation to use the licence fee negotiations to influence the BBC?
Absolutely.
When you talk about atrocity stories, what you really are saying is that the politicians would like to control the BBC, control what it would put out.
You remember telling me to behave till Christmas?
Well, I was only warning you, Alasdair. I wasn't threatening you.
But isn't that what you're saying,
program.
Julian? Aren't you saying to Alasdair Milne and to Ian Trathan, if you behave yourself and there's no more atrocity stories, we might just find a few more bob for you?
Let me just explain this little in-joke here. In fact, I think you're referring to an edition of The Editors last year, aren't you, where Alasdair Milne asked you, Julian Critchley, whether you thought the BBC was going to get an increase in the licence fee, and you said, what was it?
Only
yes,
if it behaves itself.
But what kind of service is that, where we actually can have, Julian, describing as the court, with one voice in court? Surely we must have a new system where the BBC actually gets the guarantee of independence, which it pretends it's got at the moment.
Why should politicians resist the idea of the licence fee being fixed by some independent arbitrational body of some kind?
Because politics is not a rational activity, Michael. If it were a rational activity, things would be very different.
No, but there must be an argument. There must be an argument as to why the politicians want to have this embarrassment round their shoulders every year as inflation goes up.
It's not an embarrassment.
It's a joy at times.
It is really a very effective political weapon for keeping
Vincent,
the
does
media
it
quiet.
affect the BBC? Do you think that the BBC does bend in the face of the political wind?
I have to say that it is noticeable. Whenever there is financial anxiety in the BBC, there is also editorial timidity. There's a tendency, understandable enough, to play it safe. Sometimes that has very undesirable consequences.
Alasdair Milne, is it avoidable if you have a licence fee, and if the BBC clings so ferociously to it, at a time when you're having to go back cap in hand to the government almost every year now? I mean, the licence fee was changed every decade at most for 50 years. Now you're a supplicant to the government all the time.
Well, supplicant's too strong a word, because we, in fact, Partridge, Vincent and others, the case is argued with some asperity in the corridors of the Home Office.
But in private, Alasdair, I think. On the
well, no longer. That's partly why we're here tonight.
Okay.
But, I mean, it's very much in private in the past and whispered in dark corridors, but as I say, not in a supplicatory mode. On the other hand, a year-by-year process simply means, and you're quite right, that you get a licence increase, it's not enough anyway, and you start arguing the case for an increase the day after. And that gets you into a kind of perpetual mode of discussion with the Home Office.
Well, why can't we have a better system, Alasdair?
Well,
why can't we have...
What we want is an independent body, of course, to distance us, if that's possible, from government. So one has to say that the history of the recent past is littered with cases of independent bodies. I mean, Boyles and UGCs who are overruled by governments every day
All
of
of
the
whom
week.
are disregarded whenever their findings are embarrassing.
Yes,
because
Not entirely true. What about university grants?
Well, the UGC,
commissions?
our own chairman, who God knows about the UGC, will tell you now that 10 years ago it was a marvellous invention and he wouldn't have anything to do
The
with it.
UGC is the committee which funds universities with central government
In
money.
times of inflation, they are equally as in miserable condition as we ourselves.
You see, this is what I think the public really want. The public want much more open discussion of what
I
goes
agree
on
with
in
you.
this process. You know, in terms of knowing what they're paying
I'll tell
for
you what
and
we
why
want.
they're
We
paying
want
for
cash
it.
across the counter monthly, and the Home Office have said no because they say it's too difficult. £3 a month is a damn sight better than 34 quid a year. I mean, even 9p a day, but that's out of the question. We want it paid in every other possible way, by direct debit, by credit card. I mean, in this country, a lot of people don't have credit cards. The Germans all pay with bank accounts. 95% of them have bank accounts. Only 45% here do. We want all kinds of devices to get it paid so that it ameliorates the annual payment, which Annan, of course, said should continue, but we say it shouldn't.
So you just want to tinker with the licence fee. You want it
We
paid
want a
on
different
the phone
method
bill
of
as in
collection, which
Sweden
we think
or-
would reduce the opprobrium which
You
it
see,
now
it's more
enjoys.
urgent than that. We need a decision now on the BBC's income, and the more we talk about the licence fee and alternatives, the more we can get lost in possible new systems and so on. The fact of the matter is, we ought to get back to Julian Critchley's point. He rightly said it's the business of the government to take a decision. I don't believe it'll hand it across to anybody. It has lamentably failed to ensure that the BBC has approximately the same income as ITV. A week ago, the Home Secretary made it clear that he hasn't the slightest intention of doing anything about that for 2 years. In those 2 years, the BBC will go further downhill. The programmes will deteriorate, the staff will suffer. Action is needed now.
But Nick, there is an underlying assumption there that ITV's income is assured in some way. It isn't. We've had a long run. We've had 4 or 5 years of increasing revenue. That was partly due to pent-up money during periods of price restraint and so on.
Why is everyone flashing to get the
what admires them-
franchises?
one
Why is
doesn't-
everyone
yes.
competing to get the franchises? It's going to lose money.
One does
But
admire their
I'm
masochism.
I'm sorry, I didn't say it was going to lose money. I said that you cannot assume that it will go on at its present level and it will increase every year by the inflation rate or more. I think Harold Lind made the point in the film that advertising money is not turned on and off at the behest of the broadcasters or the media.
I must say, I hope that we don't get into the advertising argument because of the nature of the BBC.
But without it, if you have to crystal ball
Well, I'll
gaze,
give you one
what
example.
do you think the BBC is going to be like in 5 or 10 years'
Well,
time?
it will really depend on how strong the BBC is prepared to be with the public and with members of Parliament. How united the BBC and its staff are prepared to be in taking the issue to the public and explaining just exactly what the costs are. Now, I'll give you one small point, which is not known, and I invite Julian Critchley to take it back. The BBC made a profit every year, except for the war years, between 1927 and 1964. It had a surplus of income over expenditure, totalling £105 million. Do you know what happened to that money? The government kept it. It actually retained it back, so that the BBC, which by good housekeeping had saved £105 million, and by today's figures that would be worth £600 million, the Treasury actually kept that money back from the BBC. Now, nobody has actually gone up and said to the Treasury, except in private, but I'd like to hear what you have to say, could the BBC not have that money back? Because £600 million would make a great deal of difference.
Slightly late in the day, Vincent, isn't it?
Well, Alasdair, if we're talking about changing the system, it would be nice to actually know what the Treasury did with the money.
But surely we've got to be more radical than that. Surely we've got to talk in terms that Annan suggested of cutting off radio from TV. That always seems to me absolutely sensible thing to do. They're rather different enterprises. Why don't you cut them? Why don't you then look for more independent finance for the radio?
Look, straightforwardly, Barry, because we believe, and the external services will tell you this as an absolute truth, that the BBC United is a very strong political force.
Yeah.
If it were broken into independent fragments, so they would... the the external services would be the first to feel the draft, radio to feel the draft next, and television last, because
Alasdair Milne, do you think that's going to happen?
No.
Are you fearful for the future of the BBC?
No, I'm not actually. I mean, I share Tony's anxiety about the